5,000 years ago, the Sumerians described a specific category of human soul that, upon death, refused to leave. Not all souls, not most souls, a specific category. These souls remained, the tablets say, in a transitional realm, not in the underworld proper, not among the living, somewhere between. The Sumerians had a name for the category. They had a name for the realm. They had a name for the condition itself. And they had instructions for what to do when one of these souls became attached to a living relative. The Akkadian word is Etemmu. The older Sumerian word is Gidam. Both terms appear in the surviving cuneiform corpus from the 3rd millennium BCE through the late 1st millennium BCE, a span of more than 2,000 years. The continuity is unusual. Most Sumerian concepts evolved or were transformed by their Akkadian successors. Etemmu remained, across this entire period, what it had always been. What it had always been was the spirit of a deceased person whose death was, in some specific way, incomplete. The texts are precise about what incompleteness means. An Etemmu was not the spirit of an ordinary dead person. The Sumerians had a separate vocabulary for the ordinary dead, who were assumed to have crossed into the underworld and were not expected to return except in the form of remembered ancestors during the appropriate seasonal observances. An Etemmu was something else. The texts identify 4 conditions under which a deceased person became an Etemmu rather than an ordinary deceased. First condition, the person was not properly buried. Their body was lost, or it was buried in haste without the appropriate rituals, or it was buried in foreign soil, far from the family graves. Second condition, the person died violently, in battle, by accident, by murder, by the kind of sudden death that the Sumerians believed left the soul unable to comprehend that the death had occurred. Third condition, the person was not mourned by the appropriate number of relatives. The texts specify minimums. When fewer than the minimum were available, or when the relatives failed to perform the mourning, the deceased risked becoming an Etemmu. Fourth condition, the person had left something incomplete at the moment of death, a debt unpaid, a promise unkept, a child unraised, a vendetta unresolved. The texts call this condition libu male, a heart that is still full, meaning the deceased person's purposes had not been emptied out by the natural progression of a finished life. Any of these 4 conditions, the surviving passages say, could turn an ordinary death into the creation of an Etemmu. Look, the Sumerians were not making theological claims here. The way these texts are written, they are making observational claims. The scribes who composed them and the priests who used them were treating the Etemmu phenomenon as a category of event that they had observed in actual households. The texts read more like ancient medical literature than like religious doctrine. They describe what to do, what symptoms to watch for, what rituals are effective, what rituals are not. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Etemmu tradition. It was practical. It was not a spiritual abstraction. The Sumerians, over many centuries, had developed a working framework for dealing with what they identified as a recurring problem in human life: the dead who do not finish dying. The name for that problem was Etemmu. The Sumerians believed that death itself was a process, not an instant. The body's cessation was only the first stage. After the cessation, the spirit remained at the place of death for a period the texts call the karatu, which is generally translated as the wait. During the karatu, the spirit perceived the body, perceived the room or location of death, perceived the living people who were responding to the death. This perception, the texts say, was the first opportunity for misalignment. If, during the karatu, the dying person's full attention had been focused on something other than the dying, the spirit could fail to recognize that the death had occurred. A soldier dying in the chaos of battle, with his last thoughts on his comrades or his weapon, might not realize what had happened. A mother dying suddenly in childbirth, with her attention fully on the child, might not notice the line being crossed. A merchant dying on the road, alone, with no one to confirm the moment, might continue to perceive himself as alive. In each of these cases, the Karatu would not end. The spirit would remain. The body would be eventually buried. The relatives would eventually move on. The spirit would still be there. This was the first way an Etemmu was created. The second way was different. It involved a deliberate decision. The texts describe a phenomenon in which the dying person, fully aware that death was occurring, chose not to allow it to complete. The reasons varied. An unfinished obligation, a wrong unpunished, a love uncompleted, a child who would be alone, a pursuit that had defined the entire life and had not yet reached its end. In these cases, the spirit did not fail to recognize the death. The spirit refused it. The Sumerians believed that this refusal was, in most cases, futile. The body was dying. The breath was leaving. The blood was cooling. No amount of refusal could undo what had been set in motion. But the refusal itself, the texts say, produced a particular kind of consequence. The spirit, having refused to cross over, was no longer fully connected to the body. The body died. But the spirit, having declared its intention to remain, was now in a state that the texts describe as inamatati rakati, in the empty lands. Not in the world of the living, not in the underworld. Somewhere between. The Sumerians called this in-between condition the Gidiem state. To be in the Gidim state was to be a spirit that had not completed its transition because it had chosen, before death, to refuse the completion. And the Gidim state, the texts say, was not a final destination. It was a holding pattern. What sustained the holding pattern, the texts explain, was the unfinished thing that had caused the refusal in the first place. As long as the unfinished thing remained unfinished, the spirit remained in Gidam. When the unfinished thing was completed, either by the spirit itself or by the actions of the living relatives, the spirit could finally cross. This is the crucial insight the Etemmu tradition preserves. The Sumerians did not believe that the dead in this category were stuck because of some cosmic decree. They believed the dead were stuck because of something specific they had left undone. The completion of that specific thing was the key to release. The realm that the Etemmu refuses to enter has a name. The Sumerians called it Kur. The Akkadians, who inherited the concept, called it Ursetu, the earth, or Aralu, an older word of uncertain etymology. In all three vocabularies, the realm is described in surprising consistency. It is a place beneath the earth. It is reached by a descent through 7 gates. It is ruled by a goddess named Ereshkigal, the elder sister of Inanna, who was the great goddess of the upper world. The most extensive description of Kur preserved in cuneiform comes from a tablet series known as Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. The series tells the story of Inanna, the goddess of the upper world, who decides to descend to the underworld of her sister. Her reasons are not entirely clear in the surviving passages. She prepares herself for the journey. She dresses in her finest garments. She wears her crown. She carries her rod and her ring. She arms herself with the trappings of her authority. And she descends. At the first gate of Kur, the gatekeeper stops her. He demands her crown. She protests. He says the rules of the underworld are absolute. She surrenders her crown. At the second gate, the gatekeeper demands her earrings. She surrenders them. At the third gate, her necklace. At the fourth gate, the pins from her breast. At the fifth gate, her belt of birthstones. At the sixth gate, the rod and ring of her authority. At the seventh gate, the last of her garments, her royal robe. When she passes through the seventh gate, Inanna is naked. She has surrendered every piece of identity she carried with her. She enters the throne room of Ereshkigal, having nothing left of what she was when she began the descent. This is the canonical description of how one enters Kur. For the purposes of the Etemmu tradition, The relevant detail in this tablet series is the gate sequence. 7 gates, 7 surrenders, each one a piece of who the entering soul had been in the upper world. The Sumerians understood Kur not as a place of punishment, the way later religious traditions would describe an underworld. They understood it as a place of completion. The 7 surrenders were not penalties. They were the necessary releases that allowed the soul to enter its final state. Without the surrenders, the entry could not happen. This is what the Etemmu refuses. The Etemmu, the texts say, has reached the first gate but cannot pass it, or the second, or the third. The specific gate varies by the nature of the unfinished business that holds the spirit. A spirit holding a refusal connected to authority might not be able to pass the gate that demands the rod and ring. A spirit holding a refusal connected to love might not be able to pass the gate that demands the breastpins. The specifics of the unfinished business correspond to the specific gate at which the spirit halts. And so the Etemmu remains, the tablets say, in the corridor between the gates. Not in the upper world, not in the throne room of Ereshkigal. In one of the 7 antechambers, forever if necessary, until the surrender at that specific gate can be made. The surrender, in many cases, requires action by the living. The living relative must perform the completion that the deceased could not perform. The unfinished thing must be finished. The unsaid thing must be said. The unpaid debt must be paid. When this happens, the texts say, the Etemmu finally surrenders at the gate. The gate opens. The spirit moves to the next gate. It continues, eventually, through all 7, into the presence of Ereshkigal, into the final completion of its death. This is why, in the Mesopotamian tradition, the living were responsible for the completion of the dead. The responsibility was not symbolic. It was operational. The living were, in a literal sense, the only beings in the cosmos who could complete what the dead had left undone, because the dead were no longer in a position to act. The living acted on behalf of the dead. The dead, in exchange, could complete their crossing. This exchange, the texts emphasize, was the entire purpose of the Kispu ritual. The Kispu was a ritual offering made by the living to their deceased ancestors. The offerings were specific: a small portion of food, a small portion of drink, the speaking of the deceased's name aloud. The ritual was performed, according to the surviving instructions, on specific days of the lunar calendar, particularly the day of the new moon and the day of the full moon. The purpose of the Kispu, however, was not what later religious traditions might describe as ancestor worship. The Kispu was, the texts say, an ongoing reminder to the deceased that they were not forgotten. The performance of the Kispu communicated, ritually, that the living relatives had not lost their connection to the dead, that the unfinished business of the dead had not been abandoned, that the work of completion was continuing. When the Kispu was performed, the texts say, the Etemmu was satisfied. The connection was alive. The completion was in progress. The spirit could rest in its antechamber, knowing that the living were still working on its behalf. When the Kispu was not performed, the texts continue. The Etemmu became active. What active meant, in the Mesopotamian vocabulary, was not friendly. An Etemmu that had been forgotten, that had stopped receiving the periodic communication of the Kispu ritual, did not patiently wait. It came back. It returned to the living relatives who had abandoned it, and it began to demand. The text described the manifestations in detail. A relative who had stopped performing the Kispu would begin to experience symptoms specifically associated with Etemmu attachment, dreams in which the deceased appeared and made requests, recurring physical maladies that had no medical cause, the sense of being watched, the feeling, particularly at certain hours of the night, of an unseen presence in the home. More disturbingly, the texts say the relative would begin to repeat patterns associated with the deceased. If the deceased had died in a particular way, the relative might begin to behave as if heading toward that same way. If the deceased had been involved in a specific conflict, the relative would find themselves drawn into similar conflicts. If the deceased had been afflicted by a particular vice, the relative would develop the same vice. The deceased was using the living relative to attempt to complete its unfinished business. This is the phenomenon that modern psychology calls intergenerational trauma transmission. The mechanism, in the modern frame, is debated: epigenetic modification, behavioral modeling, unconscious patterning. The clinical descriptions are well established: the transmission of suffering across generations in the absence of any direct contact between the original sufferer and the descendant has been documented in survivors' families across many traumatic events. The Sumerians did not have access to epigenetic theory. They did not have modern psychology. But they had observed the phenomenon, and they had developed a framework for understanding it, and the framework they developed identified the cause as the unaddressed Etemmu of an ancestor whose work had not been completed. Whether the Sumerian explanation is metaphorical or literal is perhaps the wrong question. The Sumerians had identified, 4,000 years before any modern field of study, the same pattern that modern researchers have only recently documented. They had developed a working response to it, and they had transmitted the framework in writing across multiple millennia so that the framework would be available to anyone who chose to read it. The framework is sitting today in the British Museum. It is open to study by appointment. The texts that preserve the Etemmu tradition end in most copies with the same instruction. The instruction is this: if a living person, while reading the Etemmu literature, recognizes their own family in the descriptions, that person should not assume the family is cursed. The texts are explicit on this point. The Etemmu is not a curse. The Etemmu is an obligation that has not been completed. The completion is always possible. The completion, the texts say, requires the identification of the specific unfinished thing. The reading of the family history, the location of the gate at which the ancestor is held, the performance of the specific action required to make the surrender at that gate. When the action is performed, the Etemmu releases. The patterns end. The descendants are free. When the action is not performed, the texts continue. The Etemmu does not release. The patterns continue. The next generation inherits what the current generation did not address. The choice in every generation is the same. The KAR 184 incantation, recovered from Nineveh and now held at the British Museum, contains a final line that has been variously translated. The most defensible rendering is, "The wanderer who has wandered without rest may rest, when the wanderer's path is walked by another." The wanderer is the Etemmu. The other is the living relative who completes the unfinished business. The path is the work of recognition, the reading of the family record, the finding of what was left. The Sumerians had, in the tablets they buried in Nineveh, addressed the question directly. They had said, in passages that have been read and reread since George Smith first translated them in the 1870s, that the door between the Etemmu and the living relative is always open. The living can always reach the spirit. The spirit, when reached, will always indicate what remains undone. The reaching, the texts say, requires no priest, no ritual, no specialized knowledge. It requires only attention. Sustained, honest, toward the family record. The relative who pays attention finds the unfinished thing. The unfinished thing, once identified, can almost always be completed. The completion is the release. The Sumerians wrote this down on clay 5,000 years ago and buried it under a city that itself would not be excavated for 2,500 years after that. The tablets are still there. The instructions are still there. The unfinished thing, in most family lines, is also still there. It is waiting.